Berlin, April 30th, 1945. 9 meters beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, a narrow corridor lit by a single generator hums with the sound of machinery that will not run for much longer. Above ground, Soviet artillery has reduced the once grand avenues of the German capital to fields of rubble and broken masonry, and the crash of shells lands so frequently now that those below have stopped flinching at each one. The air in the corridors is thick with the smell of damp concrete, diesel fumes, and unwashed bodies, a stale, close atmosphere that visitors in earlier, calmer months had already found suffocating. Below, in a warren of concrete rooms barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, the men and women who remain loyal to Adolf Hitler wait for an ending they can sense but cannot yet name. Secretaries type up documents nobody will ever read. Guards stand at posts defending an entrance that no relief force is coming to reach. Children play with toy soldiers on a bunk bed, unaware that within hours their own lives will be deliberately ended by the people meant to protect them. Somewhere around 3:30 in the afternoon, a single gunshot is heard, muffled by thick walls and drowned almost immediately by the low thunder of shelling overhead. Nobody rushes in straight away. There is a strange, deliberate pause, several minutes in which those closest to the small study hesitate at the threshold, as though delaying the confirmation might somehow delay the fact itself. When the door finally opens, what the witnesses describe afterwards will become one of the most argued over accounts in modern history, a story built from fragments, contradictions, forged testimony, and documents that vanished into Soviet archives for decades. Outside, the Red Army is barely a few streets away, close enough that the individual crack of small arms fire can occasionally be distinguished from the steady roll of artillery. This is the mystery of what actually happened underground in the Führerbunker in the final days of April 1945, and why, more than 80 years later, historians are still piecing together an event that some of the last people alive to witness it worked very hard to obscure. It matters not simply as a grim historical curiosity, but because the way this story was manufactured, suppressed, and slowly reassembled tells us something about how history itself gets written in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, when the people with the clearest view of events have the strongest reasons to lie about what they saw. The problem facing anyone trying to reconstruct these events begins with the simple fact that almost nobody involved had any incentive to tell the truth. By the last week of April 1945, the bunker held a shrinking cast of Nazi officials, secretaries, adjutants, and soldiers, many of whom would shortly be captured by Soviet forces and subjected to interrogation under conditions that hardly encouraged candor. A person who had spent the war working directly for Adolf Hitler, facing Soviet captors in the immediate, furious aftermath of the fall of Berlin, had every reason to minimize their own proximity to events, to soften their account of what they had seen, or simply to say as little as possible and hope to be forgotten. Some accounts given in the first days of captivity contradict statements the same individuals gave years later in calmer circumstances, once the immediate danger of summary justice had passed, which leaves historians with layered, shifting testimony rather than a single reliable record. The Soviets, for their part, had every reason to shape the narrative to their own ends. Stalin initially suppressed confirmation of Hitler's death for weeks, at one point suggesting to Allied leaders that the German dictator might have escaped, a claim that fed conspiracy theories for generations, and that historians now generally regard as a deliberate piece of political theater, useful for suggesting to the Western Allies that Moscow alone held the real answers. The Soviet counterintelligence agency Smersh took possession of what they believed to be Hitler's remains within days of the fall of Berlin, yet did not publicly confirm the details of a forensic identification for years, and even then only in carefully controlled releases that omitted inconvenient uncertainties. Meanwhile, the physical evidence itself was compromised almost immediately. Witnesses described bodies being carried into the Chancellery garden and hastily burned using petrol siphoned from vehicles, in a crater already pockmarked by shell fire, with Soviet troops approaching from barely a few streets away, an improvised cremation lasting hours rather than the sustained heat a proper crematorium would provide, which left recognizable remains rather than the complete destruction those present had hoped for. The chaos of a collapsing capital, combined with deliberate Soviet secrecy and the self-serving testimony of surviving bunker staff, eager to distance themselves from the regime, created a historical record riddled with gaps. Add to this the sheer difficulty of the physical environment itself. Berlin, in early May 1945, was a city of roughly 3 million people reduced to rubble in many districts, its administrative records scattered or destroyed, its population fleeing or hiding, its remaining officials more concerned with survival than record-keeping. For decades, the exact sequence of events, the method of death, the location of remains, and even the precise number of people who died in the bunker complex in those final 72 hours remained genuinely uncertain, not because nobody was interested, but because the truth had been buried under layers of wartime propaganda, Cold War secrecy, and basic human self-preservation, and because the one power with the clearest physical evidence had every strategic reason to keep that evidence locked away for as long as possible. Reconstructing what actually happened has depended on painstaking work by historians, forensic scientists, and archivists, much of it only possible once Soviet and later Russian archives began, however grudgingly, to open their doors. The bunker itself, formerly known as the Führerbunker, was not a single structure but two connected complexes built beneath the Reich Chancellery gardens in Berlin's government quarter. The lower bunker, the Führerbunker proper, sat roughly 9 meters below ground, its ceiling and walls reinforced with concrete up to 4 meters thick in places, designed to withstand direct hits from conventional bombs, a thickness roughly equivalent to stacking 2 double-decker buses one on top of the other. It had been expanded in 1944 as Allied bombing intensified, connecting to an older, shallower structure known as the Führerbunker, which had originally served as an air raid shelter for the Chancellery staff before the war turned decisively against Germany. Together, they formed a cramped complex of some 30 rooms, including a map room where the increasingly fantastical military situation was tracked on wall charts, a small study, a telephone switchboard staffed around the clock, a generator room providing electricity and ventilation on a system never designed for permanent long-term habitation, and modest living quarters barely larger than a modern box room. Access came via a spiral staircase and a heavy steel door roughly equivalent in thickness to a bank vault, which sealed the underground world from the chaos above, and which, by the final days, guards had orders to keep locked except for essential movement. By late April, the bunker housed around 20 to 30 people at any given time, including Hitler, his companion and later wife, Eva Braun, Josef and Magda Goebbels and their 6 children, Martin Bormann, various secretaries, adjutants, and a rotating garrison of SS guards whose numbers dwindled by the day as the perimeter shrank and casualties mounted in the fighting above. The atmosphere below ground, according to multiple accounts, had become almost unbearable by the last week of April, the generator's diesel fumes mixing with the smell of unwashed uniforms and medicinal alcohol, the air recycled through a ventilation system straining under a population well beyond what it had been designed to support. The forensic reconstruction of what happened to Hitler himself relies heavily on autopsy reports conducted by Soviet military doctors in early May 1945 on remains recovered from the Chancellery garden, reports that remained classified in Moscow until the 1990s and were only fully corroborated when Russian authorities permitted limited access to fragments held in state archives, including a piece of skull with an apparent bullet exit wound examined by American researchers in 2009 using mitochondrial DNA analysis. That analysis, controversially, suggested the skull fragment likely belonged to a woman under 40, reigniting old doubts about whether the remains burned in the garden were even correctly identified in the first place, a debate that in various forms continues among historians today, since no complete, uncontested modern DNA identification of the primary remains has ever been carried out. Soviet dental records offer a second, largely independent line of evidence. Since Hitler's dentist and dental assistant were separately interrogated by Soviet officers in May 1945 and asked to identify jaw fragments and dental bridgework recovered from the garden, providing a comparison against records the dentist herself had kept, a method considered more reliable by many historians than the disputed skull fragment, precisely because it did not depend on remains that had passed through decades of Soviet handling, storage, and, on occasion, apparent carelessness. What can be established with reasonable confidence, cross-referenced from multiple surviving witness accounts including those of Secretary Traudl Junge, bodyguard Rokas Misch, and valet Heinz Linge, is a rough timeline. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony conducted within the bunker, then dictated his final political testament and private will to Junge, a document blaming Jewish influence for the war and naming Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. The following afternoon, after a final round of farewells to bunker staff, Hitler and Braun retired to the small study. Witnesses outside the door reported hearing a single gunshot. When Linge and Bormann entered shortly afterwards, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa with a gunshot wound, and Braun beside him, apparently having taken cyanide, with no visible external wound, though accounts of exactly what was seen differ in small but persistent details, differences that have fueled decades of historical argument about who saw what and when. The bodies were wrapped, carried up the emergency stairwell to the Chancellery garden under continuing artillery fire, and burned in a shell crater using petrol carried down in jerry cans, a detail witnesses compared to filling a car at a station, except carried out under shell fire with the constant risk of a direct hit ending the operation entirely. The following day, May 1st, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made the decision to kill their 6 children with cyanide before taking their own lives, a decision surviving witnesses describe with evident horror even decades later and one of the bleakest and most disputed episodes of the entire bunker story, given ongoing disagreement over exactly how the children died and who administered the poison. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, because reconstructing stories like this one takes a genuine amount of digging through sources that often contradict each other. The bunker complex itself invites comparison with other wartime command centers, and the comparison is revealing. Winston Churchill's cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, by contrast, were built for continuity of government under bombardment, not last-ditch survival, and remained connected to functioning command and communication networks throughout the war, allowing Churchill and his staff to direct operations across multiple theaters with reasonable confidence in the information reaching them. The Führerbunker, by the final weeks of April 1945, had degenerated into something closer to a besieged fortress cut off from reliable intelligence, with Hitler reportedly ordering the movement of divisions that had already been destroyed or that existed only on paper, a stark illustration of how isolation and denial had replaced functioning command by that stage of the war. German alternatives fared little better. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's primary Eastern Front headquarters for much of the war, was a sprawling network of bunkers and barracks that offered considerably more space and better communications infrastructure, but it had been abandoned and partially demolished by German engineers in January 1945 as Soviet forces advanced, forcing the retreat to Berlin in the first place. American equivalents, such as the underground command facilities used at various points by Allied High Command, were never subjected to comparable siege conditions, since Allied forces were advancing rather than collapsing, which meant the psychological pressure of encirclement, the specific horror of being trapped beneath a city under direct assault, simply had no real parallel on the Allied side. It is this combination of physical entrapment and the total collapse of any conceivable path to victory that makes the Führerbunker's final days historically distinct, less a command post in the ordinary sense than the epicenter of a regime's psychological disintegration. The impact and legacy of those 72 hours extend well beyond the immediate military situation in Berlin. The uncertainty deliberately cultivated by Soviet secrecy in the immediate aftermath had consequences that rippled for decades, fueling persistent rumors that Hitler had escaped to South America, rumors that intelligence agencies on both sides of the Cold War took seriously enough to investigate, however unproductively, well into the 1950s. Files later released show the American Central Intelligence Agency chasing sightings and rumors in Argentina and Colombia for years after the war, a testament to just how effectively the initial Soviet confusion had seeded doubt into the historical record. The Soviet decision to secretly rebury and later exhume and cremate the recovered remains in 1970, scattering the ashes into a river to prevent any future shrine, reflects how seriously Soviet authorities took the propaganda risk of physical evidence even a quarter of a century after the war ended, an operation itself kept classified and only confirmed through documents released after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For historians, the bunker's story has become something of a case study in the limits of eyewitness testimony under extreme conditions, since even honest witnesses gave accounts that shifted in small but meaningful ways across multiple interrogations and later interviews. A reminder of how memory itself can become unreliable evidence when recorded under duress or reconstructed years later for a very different audience, whether that audience was a Soviet interrogator, a post-war journalist, or a documentary crew decades on. The remains of the bunker complex were largely demolished by East German authorities in the 1950s and 1960s, with the site deliberately left unmarked to prevent it becoming a site of pilgrimage for any surviving sympathizers of the regime, and today an unassuming car park and residential apartment blocks occupy the ground above, with only a small, easily missed information board erected in 2006 acknowledging the location. A deliberate exercise in historical understatement given the events tied to the spot beneath it. The bunker's psychological legacy has proven considerably harder to erase than its physical structure. It has become, in the decades since, one of the most reproduced settings in popular culture, referenced and dramatized so often that the historical specifics have occasionally blurred with fictionalized versions, which makes the patient, source-based work of historians and forensic scientists all the more valuable, since it is often the only thing separating the documented record from the version shaped by later dramatization. So, what actually happened underground in the Führerbunker in April 1945? The honest answer is that historians can now reconstruct the broad outline with real confidence. Corroborated across multiple independent witness accounts, Soviet forensic records eventually made available, and modern forensic science applied to surviving fragments, even while acknowledging that certain specific details remain genuinely uncertain and likely always will. The date is fixed. The location is fixed. The broad sequence, the marriage, the testament, the farewells, the gunshot, the cyanide, the frantic cremation under shell fire, the following day's unspeakable decision made by the Goebbels family, all of this rests on testimony given by multiple independent witnesses whose accounts, for all their small discrepancies, converge on the same essential shape. What remains genuinely contested are the details that Soviet secrecy, wartime chaos, and the sheer difficulty of forensic work under battlefield conditions made almost impossible to pin down beyond doubt. The precise state of the remains, the reliability of individual identification methods, the exact words exchanged in a small study behind a locked door. What is not in doubt is the atmosphere of that final week, a regime collapsing in on itself in a concrete tomb 9 meters below a burning city, its leadership issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, clinging to fantasies of relief that never arrived. Men who had once commanded the resources of an entire continent found themselves, in their final days, arguing over a handful of divisions that existed only on a map pinned to a bunker wall. The gunshot, heard through a thick door on the afternoon of April 30th, marked the end of one story and the beginning of another, a decades-long effort by historians, forensic scientists, and archivists to separate fact from the propaganda, secrecy, and self-serving testimony that immediately surrounded it. What began as a mystery deliberately manufactured by a collapsing regime and a victorious but secretive Soviet state has slowly, stubbornly, been pulled back towards something resembling clarity, though gaps remain, and probably always will, in the record of those final desperate hours beneath Berlin. Every generation since has had to do a little more of the digging, chasing declassified files, testing recovered fragments, cross-checking testimony against testimony, because the people who built this particular mystery, whether in a Berlin bunker or a Moscow archive, built it to last. The bunker is gone. The car park above it gives nothing away, no plaque tall enough to catch the eye, no marker that hints at the scale of what unfolded beneath the ordinary tarmac. But the story it held, pieced together fragment by fragment across 80 years, remains one of the most thoroughly examined endings in modern history, and one of the most instructive. It is a story about what happens when power collapses into denial, when a command structure keeps issuing orders long after the war that gave those orders meaning has already been lost. It is a story about how quickly a victorious power can manufacture its own version of events, and how long it can take honest researchers to dismantle that version piece by piece. And it is, finally, a story about the limits of certainty itself, about how even the most catastrophic, most consequential events in modern history can leave behind a record full of holes that patient work can narrow but never quite close. The war in Europe ended within days of that single gunshot. The mystery it left behind took the better part of a century to even begin to resolve, and in places it is not resolved fully yet.